Hello Zero Books readers, it's me again, Douglas Lane, and in this video I'll be responding to an essay by Slavoj Žižek entitled Transgender Dogmatism is Naive and Incompatible with Freud, by taking an excerpt from David Blacker's book, What's Left of the World Today. As you watch the video, you can play a drinking game. Take a shot every time I say something that could get me canceled. The primary difficulty with Žižek's essay is its title, as the title targets a transgender dogmatism that doesn't really exist, or at least it doesn't exist in any coherent, fully worked out way. There's no fully worked out position on what it means to be transgender, but only a struggle for acceptance and discovery set in the context of pre-existing dogmas. Put another way, the difficulty with transgender identities isn't caused by the gender expression of various individuals, but by the political, economic, and social institutions that set up the context in which this struggle for recognition takes place. A variety of different types of people with very different ideas have come together in a loose coalition in order to defend some basic demands. They want legal protection, societal respect, and to have unfettered access to healthcare and to the public realm generally. Their project, like every other struggle for emancipation and equality in today's world, runs up against the ruling ideology and is transformed by it. But if you take a step back, you'll see there is no set of transgender dogmas, no real agreement about what it means to be transgender. In order to understand the unfinished nature of the term gender identity, for example, it's useful to recall the way the term gender itself entered the popular lexicon. According to the historian Joan Wallach, the modern conception of gender arose in the mid to late 20th century as part of the struggle for women's emancipation. The word gender was necessary in order to distinguish the social roles that were often assigned to people of the female sex from sex itself. The separation of gender from sex necessarily presupposed that people could step outside of their assigned roles. It perhaps even posited that there was already an identity that was not sexed, as it was from this non-sex position that one could see the distinction between gender and sex. And it is this necessary presupposition that informs Žižek's critique.
No!
Jane, honey, what is it? What's wrong? What is it? Take it easy. She must have been having a nightmare.
To conceive of gender as an identity, as a real subjective position, rather than as a social imposition on what would otherwise be a free-floating and maybe anxious subjectivity, seems to run counter to the original aim of those who conceptualized gender, even as it appears to be necessary. It's a difficulty that arises in every struggle for emancipation. We want to break free from a constricting or oppressive category, for instance, to stop thinking of ourselves as being working class, so that we might abolish class altogether. But in order to do so, we must develop class consciousness and even class power.
I feel like there's a scene in, I think it's The Thin Man, where they just, except these aren't martinis. Within the traditional framework, Marxist categories, value, commodity, surplus value, capital, have generally been taken as economic categories that affirm labor as the source of all social wealth and demonstrate the centrality of class-based exploitation in capitalism. Within that framework, in capitalism, labor is hindered from becoming fully realized. Emancipation, then, is realized in a society where labor has openly emerged as the regulating principle of society. This notion, of course, is bound to that of socialism as the self-realization of the proletariat. Labor here provides the standpoint of the critique of capitalism. A close reading of Marx's mature critique of political economy, however, calls into question the presuppositions of the traditional interpretation.
In his lecture, Postone is pointing out that what he calls traditional Marxism made the error of conceiving of labor as a trans-historical standpoint from which capitalism could be judged and transformed. What he argues is that Marx's writing did not aim at uncovering this trans-historical category, but instead aimed at demonstrating that every standpoint is historical. To create change, then, one has to risk acting from nowhere. There is nowhere to stand except maybe some imagined future location that will have its own new standpoints or identities. When Žižek takes aim at transgender dogmatism, he risks reifying categories in precisely the same way that a trans activist might. To reify something means to take something conceptual or abstract as if it's material or real. There is no correct position to take on the question of gender today, and therefore there is no one who represents the dogmatic position. Rather, there is only a symptomatic or spectral image of the politically correct transgender figure who is both the ideal ego and the ego ideal. Now, I should stop at this point and clarify these terms and this move from ideal ego to ego ideal. The ideal ego is the imagined version of the self that one seeks to become, or if not to become, then to possess. The ego ideal, on the other hand, is an assumed standpoint from which this endeavor to become or possess the ideal ego is judged as a failure. Since the ideal ego is an imagined perfection, when you assume this ego ideal as your vantage point, you can't help but be disgusted by what you find yourself looking at. If you assume the perspective of something perfect, then you can't help but judge your empirical self as, less than perfect. And this move also explains why prominent transgender personalities seem to always face the danger of being canceled. Someone like ContraPoints, for instance, becomes the ideal ego in the minds of many and then is found wanting as her trans fans assume the position of the ego ideal. To give another example, when my friend KMO talks about his failure as an artist, he is speaking from the vantage point of the ego ideal.
We judge other people based on what they've done, and we judge ourselves based on what we're capable of. So, to flesh this out, you consider yourself to be a creative person who just hasn't yet had the opportunity to demonstrate to the world exactly what you're capable of. And as somebody who has written, I've denied myself the rationale of, I could do better than that. Because I've demonstrated to myself consistently, week after week, year after year, that no, I can't. And, if you take that time and you develop yourself to the capacity that you can, you may discover, crap, I thought I was better than that. I thought there was more inside me than that. I thought that if the world were to shine its light through my soul and project its contents up onto some big screen, that it would look better than it actually does. So it's better to know the truth, right? Rather than to live with illusion? But is it? Really?
Let's return to Žižek's essay. He wrote, "If an individual biologically identified perceived as man experiences himself in his psychic economy as a man, it is considered a social construct. But if an individual biologically identified perceived as man experiences herself as a woman, this is read as an urge, not a simple arbitrary construct, but a deeper, non-negotiable identity, which, if the individual demands it, the demand has to be met by sex-changing surgery." But perhaps what he's describing is how the already obtained standpoint of the cisgendered male is the standpoint of the ego ideal, while the imagined female figure that the trans woman strives after is the ideal ego. And this means that what the transgendered person is striving after as he or she transitions will always turn out to be a deflationary experience. But that doesn't mean that it isn't a necessary one. Now, I have to confess, I think this move from the ideal ego to the ego ideal is transhistorical. I think it's always been sort of the human condition. However, what might be historically contingent is the way we attempt to solve this problem. That is, the way we end up judging our own lives as failures. The way we land in the position of the ego ideal in this society is rarely overcome. Rather than maturing into our own unhappiness, we set off on new quests for satisfaction. In his book, What's Left of the World, David Blacker describes this historical moment by referring to the concept of liquid modernity. He wrote, Zygmunt Bauman, who introduced the idea of liquid modernity, wrote that its characteristics are about the individual, namely increasing feelings of uncertainty and the privatization of ambivalence. A person shifts from one social position to another in a fluid manner. Nomadism becomes a general trait of the liquid modern man as he flows through his own life like a tourist, changing places, jobs, spouses, values, and sometimes more, such as political or sexual orientation, excluding himself from traditional networks of support while also freeing himself from the restrictions or requirements those networks impose. Now, this exhausting fluidity is often sold to us as a kind of liberation, but what drives it isn't any self-generated drive for perfection, but the demands of the capitalist economy. It is the precarity of our material life, the constant transformation, for instance, of the job market, that makes constant questing after the ideal ego necessary. And Blacker sees this situation as one headed for crisis. He wrote, quote, "But the identity, liquidity, can only last so long and go so far. We are not wired to sustain this churning indefinitely." And by wired, I do not mean some kind of vulgar biological determinism. I am asserting only the barest of philosophical anthropologies. We are narrative creatures who seek meanings in our lives. End quote. Radicals, and most especially revolutionaries, are in a very difficult position. On the one hand, we aim at emancipating humanity so that everyone can develop and realize their own ideas and desires. But on the other hand, we know that these ideas and desires are determined by the material conditions of society. That is, we know that the way we organize to produce and reproduce the things we need to maintain our social existence determines what we want. Our ideal ego is always constructed in service to the fetishized ruling ideas of society. Further, given that our material production isn't ruled by narratives, myths, feelings, or anything that we might be able to intuitively comprehend, but is instead governed by what I'll just call economic abstractions, we end up in the not very sexy position of having to think abstractly about our own liberation. What appears to us as a struggle for our own happiness, as a way to hold on to or discover our authentic selves, usually ends up servicing the very system that oppresses us. We have to avoid remaining within the frame and within the conceptions that society provides for us, and not spend too much time arguing over whether or not transgender identities are more radical than cisgendered ones, whether or not a woman who decides to have children and raise them rather than enter the job market is self-hating or somehow backwards, even as we avoid valorizing cisgendered people or stay-at-home mothers. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx described the double nature of capitalism quite accurately when he wrote that the bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked upon with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. Getting beyond this money relation probably won't mean that we'll find ourselves returning to an idyllic past, some rural family farm, some set of organic community relations. But it also probably won't mean that we'll all have to get sex change operations in order to fit ourselves into the new politically correct socialist ideal ego. Instead, I think what we have to face is that we don't know. We don't have any clear conception of what types of people will be in this new society set upon a new foundation. But one thing I think we can be sure of is that whatever we turn out to be like, we'll probably find ourselves to be somewhat wanting. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.